this computer. Can you guys see my desktop?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, so what I want to do, I'm going to just take some big notes. So you might want to get a notebook if you are at a desk or obviously on your computer to kind of, my goal here that I want to do is kind of put all of this together. We have two big threads in this class, and the first one is the idea of rhetoric, which is defined as persuasive communication. It's also defined as effective communication. And that's really a big focus of, in my opinion, a college education and what that would look like, because so much of what we do is about communication. So one of the things we're trying to do is understand a little bit more about contemporary theories of rhetoric. So this kind of, academics are really good about creating theories about what makes something work and what makes other things not work. And we're going to connect that to the kind of writing on the web. And this connects to presumably primarily style, but also, as we're going to see in the examples that I've found to show, a kind of visual intelligence and multimodality. So again, one of the things that this course emphasizes is that we have multiple modes to communicate in. Multi-modality, primarily visual, audio, and alphabetic text. And there's a good argument that alphabetic text is actually a pretty weak way to communicate. Side note, I've been listening to this podcast on, it's called The Good Life Project. It's very good. He interviewed someone, I need to get their name, on the science of listening. And they said that the words that we use is somewhere between 10 to 20% of the act of communication, and our tone of voice, the rhythm of our delivery, physical gestures, like what people see, is like 80%. So basically, point being, there's so much other things going on when we communicate that is not just the language that we use. And sadly, so much of our education, I think, focuses on the language or the words at the expense of these other bigger aspects of communication that are actually more important. And that is why we would learn to, or why we study the rhetorical situation in CO 150 and in basic communication classes. That is basically it's the audience, purpose, and the situation or the context that we're in. So in other words, we have this, my favorite lesson here is that audience is everything, and that we're basically trying to understand how we can serve the audience. And this is all I hopefully should be review, because it gets a little deeper, and it gets deeper pretty quickly in an interesting way through the history of rhetorical theory. And that's what I wanted to do. Do you remember, did we do Bitzer and Vatz earlier this semester? I thought we did that one day. It's not familiar.
Yeah, sorry, no.
Okay, good, thank you. And did we talk about Carl Rogers and Rogerian argument? I thought we did that too, but maybe we didn't.
It sounds familiar, yeah.
We're going to look at actually like the evolution of rhetorical theory from real big broad strokes, because I think this is really interesting and fascinating to understand where your website and where communication on the whole kind of is standing today. And we're going to end actually with this book, Changing the Subject by Lisa Blankenship. And this was published 2019. This is like brand new scholarship on rhetoric. And this is on, the subtext says rhetorical empathy. So it's about empathy. And notice, if we are really going to think that audience is everything, a good writing skill is actually to be empathetic to what your audience needs and only give them what they need. That makes sense, right? If you're going to serve your audience in writing, you have to understand where they're coming from and what they need.
Mm-hmm.
All right, basic, good. Okay, so Bitzer And if there's questions that you have, please interject them to make this more like a actual lecture. Bitzer has the idea that rhetoric solves situations, or there is a sense that there is an exigence or an exigency, which he defines as a imperfection marked by urgency. In other words, we have a problem. And then he says that there is an audience. And this is a group or a person. I'm actually not going to quote him because I'm going to paraphrase this one. Group or a person who can alter the exigency, i.e., who can solve the problem. And then we have what he calls constraints, which are any factor that limits, and this could be in a good or bad way, an audience's ability to act. This is another word saying, like, this is another fancy way of saying context. So Bitzer's theory, and this is, I think I should probably have looked this up to make sure I got this right. I want to say this is in the 1960s or 70s. Actually, let me double check here. 68, yes. Whoops. Okay, so we're actually at a point we can kind of zoom out to see this first theory of rhetoric that basically shows that rhetoric arises out of imperfection and the need to change that imperfection through communication to a particular audience that can affect that situation. So he says his famous argument is that rhetoric is situational. And we've already, I mean, we went over this idea a lot in class, and that the joke that we had that any question that I ask usually can be, any question that I ask, we could usually respond with, it depends, i.e., that's basically what Bitzer is saying. And it depends on a lot of different factors or different ways that the audience is or is not able to act. He's also basically saying that in a perfect world, there would be no rhetoric. i.e., we wouldn't need to communicate to make things better if everything was already great. What's interesting about this theory is that it sees rhetoric as a way of solving problems, and that those problems could be any number of things. So, you know, I normally ask students to consider, you know, like what are some particularly salient or particularly important problems that we could help solve through communication. Well, I don't know, there's big problems going on all the time. I'm particularly interested in ecosystem degradation and environmental destruction, which I read an interesting article about how that was a precipitating factor of the coronavirus. We've been destroying habitat. Those destroyed habitats bring species in closer proximity with human beings. Human beings take those species, put them into markets where it's like perfect grounds for breeding these things. These things get bred, they get transferred to humans, boom, boom, boom. Wouldn't have happened if we had really good ecosystems for animals. Okay, well, let's say we want to stop ecological devastation. You guys with me on that? You want to stop the devastation of the jungle?
Yeah.
Let's say yes. All right. So then who is in a position to do something about that?
Corporations.
Great. Let's argue to the giant corporations that are destroying the Amazon rainforest to get them to stop destroying the rainforest. How good is that going to go?
Not well without money.
Right, because what do corporations care about? Presumably, unless you're a B Corp,
Yeah.
You know, you care about these, you have obligations to your shareholders, and so you're not going to be able to just stop operations because you are limited or constrained by your concern for money. In this theory, money, if you appeal to their sense of money, that you could use that constraint to their advantage. Like, hey, if you destroy all the rainforest, what are you going to do in 20 years? So maybe actually you should only, you see what I'm saying? So you can kind of use, it's like using what they need against them. But that's horrible language, because if you're really arguing well and you're really thinking about their situation, you're not trying to argue against them. You're trying to argue for them. You're trying to help them. Okay. You guys with me so far on this foundational theory of rhetoric? And I actually am presenting this very poorly, because I should have started with Aristotle in 350 BC, who basically says rhetoric is the art of persuasion. We did go over this at the beginning of the semester, and this is the sense of ethos, logos, and pathos, where ethos is my sense of goodwill, character, credibility, my good understanding of a situation. Logos is the logic, statistics, numbers that I use. And pathos is the emotion, the values, authority, motivations that I have to do certain things. So what's interesting about Bitzer is that he ends up saying, or he ends up basically setting up this giant debate with this guy named Vatz. And Vatz is going to be in the 70s, I think. Let's see. 73. And this is kind of hilarious because it shows how petty academics are in some certain way. He writes an article called "The Myth of the Rhetorical Situation." So he basically says, hey, everything that Bitzer just said, that rhetoric is situational, that it depends on the situation, is backwards. And that he basically says that we, the writers or speakers, create rhetorical situations. We create problems to solve, i.e., problems don't just exist in the world. We have to identify them as problems. Now, this is a really interesting point, in the sense that there are problems that some people think are very big problems that other people do not think are problems at all. I'm thinking maybe of abortion rights. There are people in America whose number one concern is whether or not we allow abortions. There are other people who do not share that. We could relate this to what's going on with coronavirus right now as well in a lot of different ways. I'm going to kind of leave that because I'm trying to go through this really quickly. That still thinks, that there are audiences. He still agrees that there are situations. But he says that situations aren't rhetorical on their own. So it's not like there's a problem that needs to be solved. Situations become rhetorical when we choose to make them so. Okay. Why is this significant? He says that the writer or the speaker creates rhetoric, whereas Bitzer, remember, says that the situation creates rhetoric. Now, we could honestly have a giant debate about which one of these people is more right. I just want to show you, and I guess I'm curious, do both of these positions make sense? Does it seem like they're saying something different to you, like that they're on opposite sides of the situation? Does anyone seem more correct than the other? Does it seem like, is Bitzer right, where there's imperfections in the world that are just problematic, and that rhetoric responds to those situations? Or that there aren't really problems in the world, we just create them, and we then use language to try to solve them?
I mean, I can think of the first one, situations about that a lot faster than the second one, but I'm sure the second one still exists.
Right, I like that. It's almost, this one's easier to kind of get. There's a lot of, if you think of an imperfection and an ability for language to solve that imperfection, then we've got rhetorical theory right there. I also think it's harder to imagine that there just don't exist problems if people are dying. But Vatz could say, you really think people dying is a problem? Why? Isn't that nature?
Yeah.
And here we have kind of the entrance into some postmodern philosophy that we are not in a position to get into in here, because I don't want to create any existential crises for anybody that aren't already in them. Okay, just joking. There's two more that I want to do really quickly. This is taking longer than I thought for my normal bad lesson planning. This is Carl Rogers. You may have seen this name partially because we talked about it earlier on the semester, but he's a humanist philosopher, or humanist psychologist, I'm sorry. He adds this very nice dimension to this, that rhetoric is about understanding others. Just as much, it's about kind of understanding the audience, just as much as it is about arguing our own position. So he's basically saying that rhetoric is no longer about winning. I'm not trying to prove that I'm right. I'm not trying to conquer your ideas. I'm not trying to like argue to dominate you. I'm trying to understand you. And in this sense, rhetoric is about listening, and then offering. And he uses this language. It's not about proving you right. It's about offering a perspective based on your perspective, based on the audience's position, basically. So in other words, I am not going to try to convince you. I'm not going to try to convince you of my opinion. I'm going to try to understand where you're coming from. And only after I understand where you're coming from, which this is the sense of humanism, we all need, and then remember we looked at Maslow's hierarchy of needs. There's certain things that all of us need, and that's captured really well with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. The basis, we have our basic like food, shelter, socialization, all the way up to at the very top self-actualization, where we become the people that we're trying to be. And this idea of rhetoric is actually pretty revolutionary, since from Aristotle's time, the idea of ethos, logos, and pathos is about winning. Like it's basically, I'm going to try to convince you of this thing. And if I convince you of that, I win. Rogers basically says, no, it's about understanding where people are coming from. It's about listening to where people are coming from. And only after I understand where you're coming from, I'm going to offer a perspective that might help you, not to fix or solve the situation, but to make it better by showing that. Okay, enter Lisa Blankenship in 2019. I loved this idea in this book. Lisa Blankenship, Changing the Subject, A Theory of Rhetorical Empathy. And she says it's changing the subject, that rhetoric is about changing ourselves first and foremost. What's interesting about this is she says that empathy leads to self-transformation, which means if I'm really listening to you, there should be some change that goes on in me. Now, I don't agree with the liberate movement quite at all. I think it's right now, I think it's misguided to liberate Minnesota and liberate and go back to work and everything. However, I get it. Like, I get it. And the more I have empathy for that position, the more I feel like actually my situation is changing. Okay, so this is like a near graduate course in rhetorical theory and understanding how Aristotle's original idea of ethos, logos, and pathos gets transferred into this more kind of fine-tuned idea that there's imperfections and audiences that can do something about those imperfections, and that to argue effectively, we have to understand the audience's constraints to make sure that we use our ethos, pathos, and logos to convince them to act in a certain way, understanding their real limitations to act. And that if we're going to argue effectively, we have to understand a situation. In this sense, being a good writer is less about the writing and more about understanding the situation. I love this idea as a writing teacher, because so often I feel like my major feedback for students is the writing is actually pretty good, but your understanding of the situation isn't good enough. And that's why your cover letter didn't really hit home. This cover letter, written exceptionally well. The writing itself is great. The thinking about your audience and understanding what they need, not great. And therefore your cover letter is not great. Writing good, thinking about the audience, not so good. And I mean that writing a cover letter is a great example, because you're writing a cover letter presumably because you need a job and this audience is able to give it to you. That's going to question, well, wait, do we really need a job? What's wrong about being homeless? And Carl Rogers might respond, well, actually, we need to understand that when we understand other people's positions, we can offer something to them. And the most modern, this is not very widespread at all, but I think it's incredibly powerful to think about empathy leading to self-transformation, and that the real goal of rhetoric is a certain kind of growth that we can, and I should say personal growth here, but this relates to civic growth, to understand where people, especially particularly marginalized communities that don't really, to understand where people are coming from, have a healthier body politic, as it will. But it's also, I would say, this is the kind of personal growth that leads to professional growth as well. Okay, all of that to say that we are now ready to talk about what about your websites and your personal projects. What I love about CO 302 is that we are doing writing in digital environments. And what do we know about audiences in digital environments, i.e. readers on the web? I.e., what do they care about? What does the audience care about? What does the audience need? How can we serve them? And since we are all readers in online environments, what do we know about online audiences? What do they care about?
Short attention spans.
Yes.
Interesting content.
Quickie. We want it to be quick and easy. We also actually want it to be engaging, which could be fun, funny, something like that, helpful in some way. And interestingly, we have this idea of multiple modes of communication, and the idea of visual intelligence and visual organization of text. And now we're in a good position. We're going to shift away from these notes. I'm going to show you some examples. I could look at the notes that I've made so far and actually say that they're not very well visually organized. And there's probably a way better way to organize all of this writing to make it more accessible. I could use bold and underlines to really get, maybe to get the main point here. I probably should have used different sizes so that this up here, when I'm doing the key ideas, is really big. But when I go down to this stuff, I'm using a smaller text instead of huge. I'm going to make those, you see what I'm saying? So that actually gets us to our good example here. This is from an article, Teaching Visual Rhetoric as a Close Reading Strategy, from a scholar, Rebecca Anderson. And let's go full screen here. Can I do that? Yes. And automatically, I wanted to use this as an example to kind of show how much better this is than what I was just doing. Because we have a nice color background. There's not too much text on a page. And it's showing certain things. So if you're just listening and not seeing this, it says the goal in first year writing, we want students to understand what it means to use reading and writing for inquiry, learning, thinking, and communicating. I'm going to go through this very quickly because there's just something that basically, she's arguing that visual rhetoric works to increase students' awareness in the ways in which visual and verbal cues communicate an assignment and the possibilities for response. i.e., it's not just the language that we're using, it's the visual presentation of that language. And even in, oh no, not the App Store, even in texts, there are visual cues. The main visual cues that we have are typeface and type sizes, i.e. typographical choices. We can use graphical choices. I can input a bullet and I can use different headings, and I can use page layout choices. So this is before using images, before using any of that. These visual cues can, quote, make a difference in a reader's attitude towards a document and how readers process this information and which information that they value. So in the way that I organize, and I love this slide because it's showing, can you all see the visual layout of these pages without actually reading any of the text?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's going to be more or less inviting based on these various visual cues. This is hopefully, we're going to skip this example. I wanted to show this as an example that ties together rhetorical theory, i.e. what an audience can do, with writing on the web. And writing on the web is going to become even more important to consider how a person organizes their work. I would say a third of student work that I receive is just giant blocks of text. And about a third of emails I receive from students are just a giant block of text. And you know what that giant block of text tells me subliminally?
You're not invested in it.
Yeah, just you don't care about me. If you cared about me, you would have used some paragraph breaks. I know that sounds awful and harsh, but
True.
That's how I feel. And this example of kind of going through, what's amazing about this article is that they bring up, they have students redesign an argument prompt. So this is a argument prompt from, whoops, oh my gosh, Prezi is getting the best of me. Here we go. When you're done reading and taking notes, review your notes in the style of taking notes, as well as any markings you've made on the text in the form of a journal entry on a separate page from your notes. Jot down your current sense of what Dillard seems to be saying. Then on that same page, formulate 1 or 2 questions you believe will be fruitful to you and your classmates to pursue in your future work with Dillard's tests. Finally, jot down a sentence or two describing how you took notes and the consequences this way of taking notes seems to have had on your understanding of Dillard's essay so far. It's actually very well written instructions, but the visual cues of these instructions are awful. There's none. So she has students kind of rewrite this assignment prompt to think about what visual choices would you make? What visual strategy would you impose? Where would you include headings? Where would you include bullets? How would you rewrite this to be more visually appealing for your audience? And I know for me, this kind of clicked, the closing thoughts is that we have a mind that makes meaning out of sequential thought and focus. And that if we're going to be writing online well, we really need to consider the visual organization of our written texts as much as possible through the kind of, through what we emphasize, where we make breaks, what we partition, how we develop certain ideas, how we make relations subordinate to one another, like headings and bullet points, and how we link those things. So all of this goes into communicating on the web. And all of this connects to Evan Pushak's essay that I linked that I would encourage you to consider, that there's basically in the ways that he defines an essay as a short, interesting truth. Oops. So this is an incredibly powerful slide insofar as it's very clear what he's saying. And this kind of, this is what I'm hoping that you consider, not just in photos, but in your writing as well, is how can we create writing to make it more accessible to our audience? And the last thing I'm going to show you is this Hemingway app editor. Hemingway app helps you. It says this app highlights lengthy, complex sentences and common errors. If you see a yellow sentence, shorten or split it. If you see a red highlight, your sentence is so dense and complicated that your readers will get lost trying to follow its meandering, splitting logic. Try editing this sentence to remove the red. You can utilize a shorter word in place of a longer one. I can use a shorter word in place for a longer word. Adverbs are weakening phrases and are helpfully shown in blue. Let me just say, are shown in blue. Get rid of them and pick words. Oh, now that's in passive voice. So I could rewrite that to say blue phrases, blue phrases show unnecessary adverbs. Okay, point being, I hope what I wanted to do in this lecture that is now droning on for 30 minutes is show how rhetorical theory in the big picture, from Aristotle to Bitzer to Vatz, is really about understanding your audience and what your audience needs. And when we're thinking about your own personal projects, I really want to make sure that you're trying your best to see how you're going to serve your audience in a way that's going to help them in a quick, easy, and engaging, fun or funny way. Or, you know, if it might not be fun or funny, it could be actually professional, if that's what I'm going for. And that really, I'm hoping that the PowerPoint and the final project are ways of you exploring what this means and what that looks like. The last thing I want to say is that these assignments are intentionally vague. Let's see. Oops, sorry. Vague isn't the right word. The assignments are intentionally like kind of broad to try to get you to try to have everybody's rhetorical situations underneath one camp. So many people are doing so many different projects. And if you have a personal project, that's going to be a different rhetorical situation than a professional one. It's going to be a different rhetorical situation than an academic one. And interestingly, our purposes are kind of like interrelated. Like your personal ambitions, I hope, are somehow, I'm thinking like a puzzle, are somehow connected to your professional ambitions, somehow connected to your academic ambitions. And ideally, this course has given you a way to think about that in another way and then practice that in another way. That's what I'm hoping you get out of the last 2 weeks. And I wanted to kind of give you that rhetorical theory to try to remind you that we're not just creating a website. We're creating a website that serves the particular needs of a particular audience. And that audience could be you. I don't know who that audience is. I mean, I should know who that audience is based on what you tell me it is. But this doesn't happen in a vacuum. So for me to assess your work, I have to know, like, what are you doing? And I've been really impressed with your self-assessments that I've seen so far. Is it's like, oh, right, yeah, I agree. You do know what you're doing. And if you had more time, you would make it better. That's a given. But it seems like I'm very impressed with what people are doing, given that rhetorical situation that we identified. And it's like, we already know this. Academics are really good at telling us things we already know. But that's the main thing. My last note that I had here is that good writing is rewriting. Well, it's one of my favorite quotes. Good writing is rewriting. Nobody writes well right away. You have to go back through and be like, oh, it would be better if I visually organize this in this way. I'm going to use way more paragraphs because that's how I like to read. That's kind of the idea. That's what I had for you. And as an online communicator myself, I'm thinking, crap, what could I have done to make this easier to understand? You guys want to give me some feedback?
I mean, I thought it went well. I was able to follow your notes, which was probably the most important thing.
Cool.
Actually being here to take the notes was the best part.
Cool.
Better than organization.
Cool. I like it. And the examples from online, the screen share worked out okay?
I mean, if you're posting those notes, putting that Hemingway website thing would be
Done.
useful.
Done. I will include links for everything that I talked about so that you can look at it if you would like more. And it mainly is the Hemingway app, which they now have a desktop version of that. And you can just cut and paste any of your writing into it. So that should really help you with your style if you're trying to get better stylistically. Do we know why it's called the Hemingway app?
I was wondering that.
Do you know what Hemingway was known for as a writer?
Not particularly.
Hemingway's sentences are like boom, boom, boom. It is very difficult to improve on the economy of Hemingway's writing. Economy being how much you say and how many words that you say it in. Mm. It's crazy what he gets done in 3 sentences. And he like rewrote things 12 to 14 times or something like that.
Okay.
If you haven't read The Sun Also Rises, it's a really interesting book about people who party for their whole reason why they live is to party, which seems relevant to college students, I think. Maybe. Not all college students, but some. Any other questions that raised? Or questions that you have about your work?
Yeah, for the presentation due Monday, we're gearing that towards you particularly, right?
Yep, and your peers so that they know enough to give you feedback on your work. hopefully your peers can identify, like, I don't think that's going to work. Like, you have this big project and you're doing this. Maybe you should consider like doing this. That seems like you're trying to do too much. Or it seems like you're not, like, maybe you could do this also. Instead of just posting your songs, maybe you could post something else with your songs to make it work a certain way. So hopefully you can get feedback from not just me, but from your peers too.
And how much of our personal website integration should we allow into it? Like if our entire final presentation is our website for whatever reason,
Yes.
is that okay versus,
Yes.
oh, I'm going to write an essay, but you need to visit my website to get the entire package? Is that an acceptable plan?
Both of those are acceptable plans, and ultimately you can do with your website what you want to do with it. For the purposes of this class and your final reflection, you're going to basically say, this is how well I did on my website given my rhetorical situation. And your project is part of that, but it doesn't, like, you might do your project and be like, this does not belong on my website at all. This is just an exercise to see if I could make a video essay. And I did it, and now no one's going to see that again. Or this is a podcast that I did, or whatever. I'm just asking that it's about, for a 3-credit class, that's about 9 hours a week of work. And we're pretty much only going to be working on the project for the next 2 weeks. So it's about 15 to 18 hours of work to do something that helps you in your situation.
Cool.
And please, like, feel free. I've had some really good conversations with students about things that they're wondering for their projects. So if you're trying to wonder whether or not something would work or not, just let me know. Cool.
Okay.
Any other questions? Yep. Thank you for that, Jeff.
One question I had was, how do you suggest we, I guess, be more specific with what we're doing? Because, like, I love how broad it is, but at times I, like, feel myself struggling.
So true.
Being, like, narrow to one idea. I don't know how to word it, but yeah.
No, that's great. I would just constantly go back to your purpose and your audience of what you're trying to do, and use that to see if you can get more specific. You can also do interrogating questions, like the annoying child game is something we would do in class this part of the semester. So if you lay out your project and I ask you, why are you doing that? What are you doing that for? What does it mean? Like, asking questions an annoying child would ask, and then keep on asking them after each answer. That's going to help you specify your work. So, like, you know, like, let's say you're making some hip hop tracks. Why? What kind of hip hop? What is hip hop? What are you doing that? Like, what does that mean? Who are you doing it for? What do they like? If you had good answers for all those, like, now you're way more specific than hip hop tracks.
Yeah, that's really good. I like that.
So the other thing I like about this is, and I love that question, I should find this article. I'm going to try to find it. I think it's called, there's a Korean word called Wangchi or something like this that is like the foundation for their educational system. But they basically don't give students clear articulated outcomes or clear articulated instructions. They let students try to figure it out for themselves. Basically, there's a ton of ambiguity that students need to figure out on their own, because that's the way life is. So they feel like they're doing students a disservice by laying out everything that they need to do, that instead they just, like, basically tell students. So if I was going to do that, I would say make a 12-point PowerPoint slide, 15 seconds a slide, that sets up your work for the rest of the semester. That's it. Part of me wants to assign work like that, but students freak out because that's not the way we do education. No, like, what do you want me to do? Will this work? I don't know. I'm worried that this isn't what you want. Welcome to life. I don't know. Like, good luck. So I think that's a really interesting cultural tension, and I'm really glad you asked that question, because it is kind of, in some ways, it's like bad teaching on my part to not lay out the specifics and how to help you make it more specific. But in another way, it's also kind of partially by design to try to give you enough of a framework to work in that still you can make it your own.
Yeah, I feel like it lets us work on stuff that we're definitely more passionate about than like more like I don't know, more structured work.
Yes.
I'm really enjoying it so far, like the freedom.
Yes. But it's
and
also disconcerting, right? Because then you're questioning, like, is this going to work? Did I do this right?
Second guessing, like how you want to present it, for sure.
Yes. I'm glad you pointed that out, because I think that's the common experience of everyone in this class.
I wanted to bring that up because that's what I've been feeling.
Thank you.
Yeah, that helps for sure.
Good. Yeah, I think any way that you can make it more specific by thinking, what is it that you're actually doing? What does it actually mean to you? Who are you doing it for? How are you doing it? Why are you doing it that way? And then interestingly, we have that picture that Scott McCloud said is true of all pieces of art. There's a core to it, and then from that core, there's different layers until you get the surface of the apple, and then all those other things that make it. So you can, at any one of those stages, you could go deeper into what it is. Well, I'm looking forward to diving in to see what you guys came up with so far. I did not notice that the PowerPoint presentation did not say that you need to embed audio in your PowerPoint presentation. You could also do a screencast, use Screencast-O-Matic to basically just run your PowerPoint on your screen and then capture all of it live. So you basically be making a video if you wanted to do it that way. But it's easy to embed audio into PowerPoint slides. If you don't know how to do that, you can just Google it. I need to hear your voice and speech, because that's part of the presentation, is the speech. And you have until midnight on Monday to do that. And again, I'm being lenient I'm trying to push deadlines back for online classes. So if that's still not working for you, if you want to take more time for your final PowerPoint, you can just let me know by email. Well, thanks for being here. I hope that was helpful. I'll put a link to the Hemingway app, or you can just Google it. It's just hemingwayapp.com. And I hope that helped, thinking about the big picture and the small details of what you're doing in this class.
Thank you. That's it.
Thanks for being here. Happy Friday.
Have a good weekend.
See you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Any other questions before we call it?
No.
All right. Well, have a wonderful day. Feel free to reach out by email or set up a phone call, and we can talk if you'd like to talk about your work in particular.
Okay. Thanks.
May the rhetorical force be with you.